Good morning, people. I hope you're in fine fettle this morning. Right, so Gatsby and Chapter 8. Uh, Now, what we're going to look at here, this is obviously the death of Gatsby within this chapter. So, what you want to kind of be thinking here is, what does Fitzgerald suggest the cause for Gatsby's death is? Is it that it's down to Gatsby himself? Is there a flaw in Gatsby? Is it a kind of outside cause that leads to Gatsby's death? Because each of these is going to kind of lead us into a contextual point. If it's Tom who's responsible for Gatsby's death, then it's about that kind of conflict between the old rich and the new rich. If it's Daisy, it's possibly about the kind of shallowness of the society around him. If it's Wilson, more directly, it's a result of the kind of squeezing of these lower classes. Or if it's, yeah, sorry, I should cover that one. So we need to have a look and decide what we think the cause of Gatsby's death is. We don't have to come down to conclude on entirely one side, though. As we're discussing this, we could say that, well, Fitzgerald suggests it's multiple causes kind of working together around it. Then we need to think about kind of Gatsby's death as opposed to Myrtle's death. And you should be able to point out a number of kind of differences here. There's a lot that you can kind of draw out around the changes between the two. And then place into order. Yeah, that's a typo kind of thing. Never mind. Ignore the first bit of that kind of as a name. Essentially, what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of look over the whole of the relationship between Gatsby and Daisy across the whole of the novel, and essentially decide why that relationship is significant, not merely on a personal level, but what kind of wider social points can be made through a discussion of their relationship. So, how is their relationship reflective of that kind of wider American system at this point in time? Okay, so the first thing that you need to do, you need to open up the file that's sent with this email called The Cause. And within that one, it's a Word document, and I think there's probably about kind of 10, 11, 12, something like that, different bits I've chosen from within the chapter. And within each of those, I want you to decide whether you think that it implies that one of the causes of Gatsby's death is related to kind of Daisy, Wilson, Tom, society at large, his own flawed desires, or multiple. So for a number of those on there, you should be able to kind of connect it in and see how Fitzgerald is suggesting more than one cause, even within the kind of same section of it. And once you've decided what the kind of cause is, then what you want to do is just try and kind of pick the exact bits of evidence that drew you to that, because again, I'm giving you bits that are slightly too long to actually quote in end to end. So you've got to choose the bits that you would pick and then kind of contextualize around to make your points, okay? So pause me for a moment. I would suggest this activity probably going to take you 15 minutes to do properly and do well, okay? Okay, so I'll kind of go through them and sort of tell you how I would kind of go about discussing them. You may be able to argue other points of view. The awkward thing is that you can't give me any feedback for this. So within that first one, I would say that it's kind of a combination here of Gatsby and of Tom. So Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice. So the simile here, the image of him breaking apart is clearly linked to kind of Tom, to his malice, to his kind of destructive nature. So in many ways, this does reflect that kind of conflict between old rich and new rich within the novel. Having said that, there's also something fragile here about Gatsby's own identity. The J. Gatsby that has been created is only a kind of superficial facade. It was never a kind of proper, truly developed individual. It's only ever been a kind of construction. So it's a flaw within Gatsby in that he's created a kind of fragile identity, but it's also that conflict between old rich and new rich, and you get that from kind of Jay Gatsby broken up in that bit there. Okay. Then we get the next one. In various unrevealed capacities, he come in contact with such people before, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between them. He found her excitingly desirable. Now, within this one, obviously it's his kind of pursuit of Daisy that's kind of leading into this kind of destruction, and that separation in society between old rich and new rich. So we can have Daisy, we can have society. There's a kind of indiscernible barbed wire between, is the kind of image here that sort of suggests the separation. But again, a kind of flaw within Gatsby. He finds her desirable because she's out of reach, essentially, because he's got access to her beyond what he's normally been kind of allowed here. Now, I would say with the next two, the focus is very much on Gatsby in many ways as being the flawed one here. He essentially is kind of depicted as seeing Daisy as a kind of an object, something to kind of pursue. She becomes the prize in a competition, essentially. Right, we'll try that again. So it excited him too that many men had loved Daisy and increased her value in his eyes. And this is kind of reflective of, I suppose, of Gatsby himself, but also of that kind of wider American culture and its kind of flaws within it, in that women are still treated as kind of objects of competition, that it promotes this kind of competition between people here, that it's a society in which conflict is absolutely central. But there's also this kind of selfish nature to Gatsby. He took what he could get ravenously and scrupulously. So there's a kind of immorality that Fitzgerald gives to Gatsby here. There you go. That's a cat biting a laptop. Yeah. He took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. So in many ways, Fitzgerald kind of is implying here that Gatsby's actions are kind of immoral, that there is a legitimacy to the separation. So in many ways, Gatsby is kind of going beyond the bounds of what he should be allowed to do, because of that kind of social distance. Okay. Then we kind of go down. He'd intended probably to take what he could and go, but now he'd committed himself to the following of a grail. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. Again, it kind of comes back to Gatsby. Think about the image of the grail, though, this kind of idea of the Holy Grail. And it's is this image of something that sort of has been pursued by many, but has never actually been found. So it can be that Gatsby is kind of naive, and there's a sense of fault in that. But it's also, again, potentially we can link this to society, that what society has kind of created, an American kind of culture has created, is this pursuit of something unattainable that multiple people pursue, and they'll pursue to the end of their lives but never truly find. The Grail image is kind of an important one here. Okay, so with the next one, again, we can kind of debate around whether it's more society or Daisy or Gatsby here. And we return to the image of her voice as part of it. You get that image within it, the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves. So in society, wealth becomes the desirable kind of commodity. It does more than simply allow you to kind of buy things. Wealth kind of creates these kind of false impressions. And for Gatsby, Daisy represents something that can kind of lift him out of his origin, his place of origin. Daisy's kind of gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. Now, within the kind of the next one, it becomes a little bit kind of more Daisy's fault here, or at least the social class to which Daisy belongs. So Daisy's world is an artificial world. There's this kind of incongruous pairing with kind of cheerful snobbery, this kind of reflection of something kind of destructive with a cheerful aspect to it. And as you go down towards the bottom of this, you get, at night the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues. So his allusion here to the song is of a song that is kind of hopeless. It's kind of it's a depressing song in many ways. And the image of the dust that we've had throughout the novel returns here, and it's 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffling the shining dust. So it's Daisy who's kicking up this dust, or she's part of the group even that's kicking up this dust. It doesn't just have to be Daisy, it can be this wider social group. But if you think back to the very start of the novel, it was the foul dust that floated in the wake of his dreams that's essentially killed Gatsby. This connects into it. We're finally seeing where this foul dust is coming from, and arguably it's linked into kind of Daisy and those kind of upper class people's prejudices coming into it. The next one, it's Tom who's kind of linked into this. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was a kind of cheap sharper. And the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. So this is Gatsby placing the blame onto Tom. Gatsby clearly sees Tom as at fault. Having said that, we as the reader potentially recognise that it's not as simple as this. He says some kind of cheap sharper. Well, Gatsby is involved in crime, so maybe he's not a kind of cheap criminal, but he too is, the revelation of his criminality is something that's kind of important here. But it is Tom that's kind of turned the tide, essentially taken Daisy away from him. Dun, dun, dun. So in the next one down, we essentially have society placed in contrast to Gatsby, and society seems to be somewhat more flawed here. His lawn, so the parties we're kind of referring back to, have been crowded with the faces, so it's something anonymous, of those who had guessed at his corruption. And yes, this does reference kind of Gatsby's corruption, but at the same time, it references his kind of incorruptible dream. So Gatsby's dream itself is elevated here, as opposed to those kind of figures of society who have kind of used him and taken everything they can from him. As we get down to the last few, we get kind of references up to the murder itself. You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church? Now, this is Michaelis talking to Wilson. And yes, it's kind of looking at the breakdown of Wilson. But you could argue here that Fitzgerald is showing that kind of for those lower class individuals, especially, modern society is kind of taking away from them places of consolation for their kind of position. So you must have gone to church once, and Michaelis kind of suggesting that church and religion could provide a kind of solace for Wilson is kind of important here. Then we get kind of the last ones. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heaps, where small grey clouds took on fantastic shapes and scurried here and there in the faint dawn wind. So Wilson here, in the build-up to his kind of killing of Gatsby, it draws our attention away from Wilson himself, and he's looking out into that kind of setting that he's part of, this kind of the Valley of Ashes, where, you know, that wider setting is then placing a pressure upon him. So it's not necessarily Wilson himself, but it's, again, what society is doing to Wilson that becomes important. And again, within that last one on the other side, it's the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg that come back into this. They're pale and enormous in the dissolving night, and we get the more direct reference to these as the eyes of God in this modern world. And Michaelis, it's an advertisement. Well, yes, on one level it is, but on a symbolic level, there's more to it than that. And in reality, it's something that's kind of pushing Wilson to it, his kind of failure in this commercial world. So the last few do show Wilson as being important here, but it's also the way that society has taken things from him and the way that society is kind of pressuring him as well that arguably leads to his destruction. So in many ways, kind of Fitzgerald through this is suggesting that there are multiple factors that lead to Gatsby's death. And there's no single one that's necessarily the most significant here. They're all important in kind of leading up to his death and destruction. Right. So the next thing that you need to look at, and again, I would suggest that you kind of split a sheet in half on this. And yesterday we kind of looked at Myrtle's death. Go back over Myrtle's death, find out kind of key things you could say about Myrtle's death, and then we want to kind of compare it in to Gatsby's death. So hang on, let me find the page references. Yeah, you're basically looking at the very end of chapter 8. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler to the end of the chapter. And what I want you to do, carry out a kind of comparison between Gatsby's death and Myrtle's death. How are they different? There's some similarities. They're both dead, but think about how they're different primarily, and why Fitzgerald might be doing this, what the implications are in the way he's doing this as well. Okay, I would suggest you probably spend another kind of 10-15 minutes kind of breaking this down, okay, and then I'll go through some of the points I would make. Okay, so in comparing these two deaths, there are a few things that you potentially want to know. Now, the first thing is that with Gatsby's death, there's almost a kind of romanticism given to it. There is, through the voice of Nick, something kind of cleansing that goes with this. So it takes place in a moment he disappeared among the yellowing trees, this kind of taking place in this kind of autumn setting with the falling leaves coming with it. And the other thing to note is we don't know this for definite, but through the narrative voice of Nick, he seemingly gives Gatsby an understanding before his death. So whereas Myrtle runs out into the road, believing that this car is got Tom driving it, that she's going to be saved, that she still has a chance of escaping from this kind of valley of ashes. What we have here with Gatsby is essentially different. Um, I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. So this is the phone call, and Nick is sort of suggesting that Gatsby himself has come to a realization, and a realization about his dreams. If that was true, he must have felt he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. And he's looking up at an unfamiliar sky, and he sees how grotesque a thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight upon the scarcely created grass. So I think especially how grotesque a thing a rose is a kind of significant image here, whereas Myrtle never recognises the kind of way she's been manipulated. Gatsby does. He now sees the rose as kind of grotesque. He sees his kind of pursuit of love is kind of false. It's not the pursuit of a rose. It's something grotesque. And this is kind of continued on to the next page. He kind of sees around him breathing dreams like air. These poor ghosts breathing dreams like air. And that kind of recognition of the falsity of the dreams in society around him becomes important. So there's that initial romanticism. He goes to his death with an understanding. Fitzgerald, again, rather than kind of the death car and the brutality of the death, even Wilson is kind of turned into something more kind of sort of ethereal, essentially. He's that ashen, fantastic figure gliding towards him through the amorphous trees. So the kind of coming of death here is something more than human almost. And Gatsby's body too is protected by Nick. Nick seeks to kind of protect him kind of within this. And there was the faint, barely perceptible movement of the water. So again, the pool is the first thing that we look at. It's potentially significant that Gatsby dies in the pool, going into it for the first time. The place, it's sort of a cleansing image, a baptismal kind of image. And little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves coming across it. So this, again, before we ever get to the body, we get this kind of romantic image of the water. And it never says the body directly, it never looks at it directly. It's enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. So unlike Myrtle's death, where you get the kind of rip at the corner of her mouth, the kind of the tearing of the breast, here Gatsby's death is far more kind of subdued, far more careful. And the only kind of real hint we get of the damage is revolved it slowly, tracing like the leg of transit a thin red circle in the water. So his blood's kind of mixing with the water, this kind of slow image around the death. And it's only at the very end of the chapter that we get anything kind of coming close to the horror of Myrtle's death, in that the Holocaust was complete. Now, I always say this, people still kind of get the wrong end of the stick. Just remember that this comes before the Holocaust of World War II. It's written in the 1920s. Holocaust does still imply a kind of mass death, though, essentially. So please don't get kind of overly tied up in that. Don't try and link it to World War II. Fitzgerald didn't have a crystal ball. Okay. So he, again, it's kind of the coolness of this as well, as opposed to the kind of heat of Myrtle's death, that kind of hot and then the kind of extinguishing of something. So both deaths are kind of focused on, but there's a far more sympathetic death to Gatsby. And this suggests that Fitzgerald himself is if not glorifying Gatsby, that he's in favour of Gatsby. Remember that Gatsby is the kind of is better than the rest, that Gatsby deserves to be protected. So despite his criminality, despite that kind of corrupted nature that goes with him, he is, yes, and as a figure of the new rich, he's still worthy of that protection. Okay, now you don't need to go out and write an essay here. I'm just using the same kind of tasks that I kind of set to my first years. So rather than go out and write a full essay, I would simply kind of plan around this, because the essay question, or the question I'm setting here, doesn't really fit directly in the same way with with the kind of question that you're going to get. So there's no point kind of trying to write it out in full. And if you want to, you could do it. It'd be practice in terms of the skill set, which is why I set it for the first years. But just be aware that it's not the kind of question you're going to get. Obviously, yours is going to be comparative. It could include any of the American texts. It's going to be far more vague than this as well. Now, I posed this question to my first years. How wide does Fitzgerald suggest the relationship between Gatsby and Daisy is kind of doomed from the outset? So it's focused on the kind of methods he uses to kind of foreshadow the kind of failure of it right from the beginning, but also the way he kind of builds up the reasons for this. What is it that makes this relationship flawed? Because that's going to lead you into discussing the kind of context that goes with this as well. Okay. And I say for them, I'd set it as a kind of 751,000 words with a 200 words quotation, and I was telling them to find some critics to go into this. And again, you can spend as much time as you want on this as an activity. I would suggest that before you kind of listen to me giving some feedback, you probably spend at least kind of 30 minutes looking at it's the other sheet on the email, where I've given a kind of selection of different bits of evidence from across the text that might be used. But you could spend far longer on this, kind of planning out and looking for critics and trying to find ways to work them in, than that. So I would say 30 minutes is kind of like the baseline, what to kind of shoot for in terms of getting something from it yourself, before simply going through it and listening to me. But you could spend more time. Okay. So to be explicit, with that question in mind, I want you to look at the sheets with a quite a wide selection of kind of key extracts from across the text. How does Fitzgerald suggest the relationship is kind of doomed, and why? What reasons does he have that kind of underlie this? Okay, so I'm going to try and be kind of quite selective here, because there's a lot of evidence that I could pick out, but I don't really want to kind of make the video too long. So within that first one, it's one of those initial images we get of Gatsby kind of pursuing Daisy. Now remember the wider context, that kind of placement of the two eggs, and here he's kind of stretching his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and you get this kind of green light at the end of the dark. Now the two eggs, old rich, new rich, they appear very similar, and yet Fitzgerald is kind of suggesting that there's that water in between, that there is that kind of separation between the two, and whilst Gatsby can kind of reach across, he's never going to kind of truly manage to kind of gain the other side, essentially. So that kind of separation between old and new rich kind of suggests that in a symbolic way he's never going to kind of gain her. It's doomed from the outset. In the second one, the first bit kind of sets up the context. It's kind of Jordan describing this. Down towards the bottom of the page. Wild rumours were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York to say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented. So her family and those kind of social prejudices coming into it, her mother not allowing her to go after this soldier who is beneath her, who is lower than her. There's also a kind of shallowness kind of created around Daisy. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had her debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago. So we see that kind of inconsistency in Daisy. She's forgotten Gatsby very quickly, or at least moved past him. She is engaged to one man, then to Tom, and kind of that inconsistency, that kind of her need for stability, her need for kind of support outweighs that kind of desire for Gatsby, whereas Gatsby is very kind of consistent and dedicated in his kind of desire for her. She is not dedicated in the same way. So again, it's kind of doomed from the outset here. And again, it links into that kind of shallow upper class society. Then I want to go down, so let's pause for a second. Okay, so within the next one, again, we get that kind of move into the past through the kind of voice of Jordan. And the image here again is of a Daisy kind of haunted by the memory of Gatsby, but able to kind of move past it as well. There's a kind of inconsistency to her. So in her drunken state, she is depicted as kind of willing to give up the security and things that Tom represents. She says to kind of give back this string of pearls to whoever they belong to. So that kind of symbolic giving up of wealth, but as this kind of letter from Gatsby, kind of, where's the image? It was coming to pieces like snow in the water of this kind of bath. That leads her back into kind of simply conforming to the social requirements that are placed upon her. So she's essentially, again, it's not necessarily just that Daisy's depicted as shallow, but it's those social pressures leading her into it, and while she might wish to reject those social pressures, she's kind of placed back into it, is kind of Fitzgerald's implication here. In the next one, yeah, simply the kind of naivety to Gatsby that Fitzgerald kind of implies here. I think he half expects her to wander into one of his parties some night, and Gatsby is kind of, in terms of the kind of suggestions here around why it's doomed, well, Gatsby is naive to the separation between old and new rich. He's depicted as a man who doesn't quite understand that whilst he has gained material wealth, he has not necessarily gained the kind of social privilege he needs in order to kind of get Daisy in a legitimate sense. Okay, so within the next one, I would argue this is important because Fitzgerald is essentially showing that the dream cannot match the reality, that a human being as something kind of fallible, as something, well, human, cannot match to the kind of dream that's associated with it. So Daisy here, that was once this kind of dream image, this kind of light at the end of the dark, something to aspire to, is now simply Daisy. She's something human and something present. And the bit at the end there, now it was again a green light and a dark, his count of enchanted objects diminished by one. So the image here of something that is kind of, something that was magical is now reduced to something that is far less kind of appealing. It's simply Daisy, it's simply a human individual. The next one, coming from chapter 6, where again it's that kind of naivety that Gatsby had around the separation between old rich and new rich, that these parties that have been central to his identity are kind of revealed as something that Daisy cannot handle, essentially. So the rest offended her, and inarguably because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion. So she can't handle the kind of the party element, that kind of unrestrained element, the uncontrolled element, and this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village. That idea of kind of the personified Broadway, which is kind of synonymous with the film and theatre industry, has kind of created, that this is clearly depicted as a place of the new rich, this kind of new generation. And she's appalled by this raw vigour. She chafes under the euphemisms that she cannot come to terms with this, and essentially Gatsby must then give it up. Okay, now then Fitzgerald again has one of his movements into the past, and again he's kind of showing a human, once again like the other one, human can't match up with the dream. So whilst he has this kind of initial beautiful romanticism with Daisy and Gatsby coming together, it takes place in this autumn night. It's kind of symbolic of kind of time of change. And there's this mysterious excitement. You get the quiet lights, the humming out into the darkness. There's something beautiful about the image. Then you move into this kind of metaphor, this kind of vision of Gatsby's here. The sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone. And once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. So Gatsby does have the potential to kind of reach the heights in American society, but only if he does it alone. And in his kind of flawed way of thinking, he chooses Daisy instead. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable death. So her breath is something kind of, it will not last. It's perishable breath. And it's going to close down that kind of future potential for him. His mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So his potential for creation is going to be kind of shut down here. And he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. So this hugely hyperbolic image of the romance and potential of Gatsby himself. It's a tuning fork, that note that's been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her, and you get this change, just like the changing of the autumn leaves. His lips touched, at his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete, and he's lost it. He's kind of wed himself to this, and it's over, essentially. He's just like the flower that is beautiful, and a lot of authors use this kind of image. The flower is inevitably going to kind of die, and that's the end of it. Okay, so in the next one, again, it comes back to that idea that it's not necessarily Daisy herself that Gatsby is attracted to, but it's what she represents. And again, this is why the relationship is doomed from the outset. She was the first nice girl he'd ever known, and in this context, it means girl from upper class. And it's then not Daisy herself, but her social position, the first one he's had access to. And it's that kind of intrigue that goes with it. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs, more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms. And he's simply in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. So it's not that he's sort of pursuing Daisy, it's that he's pursuing an ideal. He's pursuing what she represents, and this means that, again, the relationship is doomed because you can't pursue an ideal in a person. It's simply flawed, is kind of Fitzgerald's implication. And again, in the next one, it's that focus on the kind of wealth that comes with it. That dun, 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 she vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. And it goes through the bought luxury of starshine, and we return to that image from before. Youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves. So again, what he desires is not Daisy, it's the wealth that she represents. And this is the kind of the reasons that his dream is doomed to fail from the outset. That, as Fitzgerald goes back into these kind of flashbacks, these kind of anecdotes of Gatsby's past, they reveal to us the kind of falsity of the dream itself. I'm going to skip past the next one because we've already kind of talked about that as early part of the lesson. The last couple will kind of skip into the last couple of the last chapter even. I called up Daisy half an hour after we had found him, called her instinctively and without hesitation, but she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. So in that final chapter, again, it returns the idea of Daisy's kind of the shallowness of her affections, that she doesn't have the fortitude or the ability to kind of follow it through. And Tom and Daisy are then depicted as kind of the same in their wealth, in their position of privilege. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated into their money and their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let people clean up the mess they had made. So Tom and Daisy are, because of their wealth, they retreat back into their money. They are inherently destructive individuals, and any relationship with Gatsby is always kind of doomed from the outset. Okay, that's it for today, people. I will finish off Gatsby after the Easter holidays, and we will then start just thinking around kind of criticism, essay questions, just as a kind of keep going bit to go alongside. Okay.